Have you ever wondered how a teenage concubine could rise from complete obscurity to become the only woman in Chinese history to rule as emperor? Well, the answer isn't luck or even political marriage. Instead, Wei Dan mastered a deadly game of palace intrigue that would make modern politicians look like amateurs, systematically eliminating rivals and manipulating three different emperors to claim ultimate power. So, in this soothing journey through ancient China, I'm going to reveal how Wei Dan transformed from a powerless servant girl into the most feared ruler in Chinese history using her intelligence, ruthless ambition, and perfect timing. This remarkable story spans decades of palace conspiracies, family betrayals, and political murders that would reshape an entire dynasty. What I'm going to do is walk you through her incredible rise to power. And by the end of this series, you'll understand exactly how she achieved the impossible. Now, to truly appreciate Wei Dan's rise, we need to understand the world she was born into. The year was 624 CE during the early Tang Dynasty when China was experiencing a golden age of prosperity and cultural achievement. The Tang capital of Chang'an was the largest city in the world. Home to over 1 million people from dozens of different cultures and kingdoms. Merchants traveled the Silk Road bringing exotic goods from as far away as Persia and Rome. Buddhist temples stood alongside Taoist shrines and Confucian mines. Art, poetry, and scholarship flourished under imperial patronage. But beneath this glittering surface lay a society built on rigid hierarchies and absolute male dominance. The Confucian social order placed the emperor at the top, followed by government officials, farmers, artisans, and merchants. Women existed outside this hierarchy entirely, defined solely by their relationships to men as daughters, wives, or mothers. A woman's highest aspiration was to bear sons who might bring honor to the family name. The concept of female ambition was not just discouraged, it was literally unthinkable. Wu Zetian was born into this world as Wu Jiao, the daughter of Wu Yihua, a wealthy timber merchant who had supported the Tang Dynasty during its rise to power. Her family background was unusual for someone who would later enter the imperial court. Most concubines came from established aristocratic families with generations of court connections. The Wu family, while prosperous, were essentially nouveau riche merchants looked down upon by the traditional nobility who traced their lineages back centuries. Wu Shiho had 3 wives, as was common for wealthy men of the era. Wu Jia's mother, Lady Yang, was his second wife, which placed Wu Jia in a precarious position within the family hierarchy. She was legitimate, but not the primary heir. She had older half-brothers from her father's first wife who would inherit the family business and properties. This early experience of competing for attention and resources in a complex family structure would prove invaluable training for the even more treacherous world of imperial politics she would later navigate. From her earliest years, Wu Jiao displayed an intelligence and determination that set her apart from other girls of her generation. While most daughters of wealthy families were educated only in domestic skills like embroidery, music, and household management, Wu Jia somehow gained access to a much broader education. Historical records suggest her father, perhaps recognizing her exceptional abilities, allowed her to study alongside her brothers. She learned to read and write classical Chinese, studied history and philosophy, and even received training in mathematics and basic military strategy. This education was revolutionary for a girl of her time. Most women, even aristocratic ones, were functionally illiterate. The ability to read and write was considered a masculine pursuit that might make a woman too independent and therefore unmarriageable. But Wu Jiao absorbed knowledge like a sponge, developing not just literacy, but genuine intellectual sophistication that would later allow her to debate with court scholars and compose her own imperial edicts. Her physical appearance was equally remarkable, though descriptions from the period must be viewed through the lens of later political propaganda. Contemporary accounts describe her as extraordinarily beautiful with perfect skin, elegant features, and an commanding presence that made her stand out in any crowd. But more importantly, she possessed what Chinese historians call dragon phoenix charisma, an almost supernatural ability to command attention and inspire both loyalty and fear in those around her. Wu Jiao's childhood was cut short in 636 when her father died unexpectedly. She was just 12 years old and his death dramatically altered her family's circumstances. Under Chinese inheritance laws, the family business and properties passed to Wu Huo's eldest son from his first wife. Wu Jiao, her mother, and her younger siblings found themselves dependent on the generosity of their half-brothers, who showed little inclination to support them generously. This experience of sudden powerlessness and financial insecurity would profoundly shape Wu's worldview. She learned firsthand how quickly fortune could change and how vulnerable women were in a system that offered them no independent legal or economic rights. Rather than accept her young women to join his imperial harem. This was a regular practice in Chinese courts where the emperor maintained hundreds of concubines ranked in elaborate hierarchies. For most families, having a daughter selected as an imperial concubine was considered a great honor that might elevate the entire family's status. For Wu Jiao, it represented something even more valuable, a chance to escape the limitations of her birth and enter the center of political power. At 14 years old, Wu Jiao was selected from thousands of candidates to become a fifth-rank concubine, given the title Kairen, which meant talented person. This was not a particularly high rank in the complex hierarchy of imperial women, but it was enough to get her inside the Forbidden City and into proximity with the most powerful man in China. The imperial harem was a world unto itself. A complex ecosystem of competition, alliance, and intrigue that made the outside political world look simple by comparison. Hundreds of women lived in luxurious apartments attended by armies of servants. But most would never even meet the emperor, much less bear his children or influence his decisions. The vast majority would live out their lives in gilded captivity, forgotten and irrelevant. Emperor Tang, born Lysimon, was one of the greatest rulers in Chinese history. He had helped his father establish the Tang Dynasty and had personally led military campaigns that expanded Chinese territory to its greatest extent. He was intelligent, cultured, and genuinely committed to good governance. But he was also a middle-aged man with dozens of wives and concubines, unlikely to pay much attention to one teenage girl among so many. Wu Jiao understood this challenge from the moment she entered the palace. Unlike other concubines who relied solely on their beauty or tried to attract the emperor's attention through traditional feminine accomplishments, she took a completely different approach. She made herself useful. Drawing on her unusual education, Wu Jiao began offering to help with administrative tasks that other concubines considered beneath them. She could read and write better than many court officials, and she had an intuitive understanding of bureaucratic processes. When the emperor needed documents copied or letters translated, Wu Jiao volunteered. When he wanted someone to read to him from historical texts, she was available with perfect pronunciation and insightful commentary. More importantly, she began to study the emperor himself with the intensity of a scholar examining ancient texts. She learned his preferences, his moods, his political concerns, and his personal insecurities. While other concubines tried to entertain him, Wu Jiao made herself indispensable by becoming his intellectual companion and trusted advisor. This strategy required incredible patience and self-control. Wu Jiao spent months, then years, slowly building her relationship with the emperor while carefully observing the complex web of palace politics around her. She identified the key players, understood the factional divisions among court officials, and began to cultivate her own network of allies among servants, eunuchs, and minor officials who had access to valuable information. The imperial court was divided into numerous competing factions based on regional origins, philosophical differences, and personal loyalties. The most powerful group consisted of the founding families who had helped establish the Tang Dynasty and felt entitled to permanent influence. These aristocratic clans looked down on newcomers like Wu Jiao and actively worked to limit the emperor's ability to promote people from outside their circle. Wu Jiao quickly realized that her merchant family background, which had seemed like a disadvantage, was actually a strength in this environment. She had no existing factional loyalties, which meant she could navigate between different groups without being automatically categorized as an enemy. She also understood commerce and economics in ways that the aristocratic officials who considered trade beneath their dignity did not. As months turned to years, Wu Jiao's influence with Emperor Tang grew steadily. She graduated from copying documents to drafting them, from reading historical texts to discussing their political implications, from listening to court debates to offering her own opinions. The emperor, who had initially seen her as just another pretty face in his harem, began to recognize her exceptional intelligence and rely on her judgment. But Wujia's ambitions extended far beyond becoming the emperor's favorite concubine. She understood that her position, while privileged, was fundamentally insecure. Imperial favor could disappear overnight, and concubines who fell from grace often found themselves exiled to remote temples or worse. She needed to build a more permanent foundation for power, and that meant expanding her influence beyond her personal relationship with the emperor. She began cultivating relationships with the emperor's children, particularly his heir apparent, Prince Lin Can. This was dangerous territory, as court protocol strictly limited contact between concubines and imperial princes. But Wu Jiao was careful to position her interactions as educational and administrative rather than personal. She offered to help with the prince's correspondence, provided insights into court politics, and gradually made herself useful to the future emperor as well as the current one. Unfortunately, Wu Jiao's careful cultivation of Prince Li Qing would prove to be a miscalculation that nearly ended her political career before it truly began. The prince, despite being the designated heir, was struggling with personal demons that made him increasingly unstable and unreliable as a political ally. Lai Chuncan had grown up under enormous pressure as the crown prince of the world's most powerful empire. Every aspect of his life was scrutinized by court officials. His education was rigidly controlled by Confucian tutors. And his future role as emperor weighed heavily on his young shoulders. Rather than rising to meet these expectations, the prince began to rebel in increasingly dangerous ways. He developed a fascination with Turkish culture, adopting their clothing, customs, and even their military tactics. This was seen as deeply inappropriate for a future Chinese emperor, especially since the Tang Dynasty was actively fighting Turkish tribes on the northern frontier. Even more troubling, Lin Can began to surround himself with disreputable companions and engage in behavior that court observers considered beneath imperial dignity. Wu Jiao watched these developments with growing concern. Her political instincts told her that the prince's erratic behavior was making him vulnerable to his enemies at court and by extension making her vulnerable as well. She had invested significant time and energy in building a relationship with him. But now that investment was becoming a liability. The situation came to a head in Sixth Form 3 when Prince Li Chainan was implicated in a conspiracy to assassinate his father and seize the throne prematurely. The plot was discovered before it could be executed. But the mere fact that the crown prince had participated in such a scheme sent shock waves through the imperial court. Emperor Tang was devastated by his son's betrayal and immediately began investigating everyone who. Wu Jiao found herself in an incredibly precarious position. Her connections to Lin Can were well documented and many court officials viewed her as a potential conspirator who might have influenced the prince's rebellious behavior. The investigation that followed was thorough and ruthless, with dozens of people interrogated, tortured, and executed for their alleged roles in the conspiracy. But Wu Jiao's years of careful observation and relationship building now paid unexpected dividends. She had maintained connections with officials from multiple factions, and several of them spoke on her behalf during the investigation. More importantly, her genuine usefulness to the emperor as an administrative assistant and intellectual companion had created a reservoir of goodwill that protected her from the worst suspicions. Emperor Tang ultimately concluded that Wu Jiao had been naive rather than treacherous in her relationship with the disgraced prince. She had been used by Lin Can rather than using him, a victim of his manipulation, rather than a co-conspirator in his rebellion. This interpretation allowed the emperor to maintain his relationship with Wu Jiao while distancing himself from the painful memory of his son's betrayal. The prince conspiracy crisis taught Wu Jiao several crucial lessons about palace politics that would guide her future actions. First, she learned that backing the wrong person, even for rational reasons, could be catastrophic. Political calculations that seemed logical could be overturned overnight by unexpected events or personality flaws. Second, she discovered the immense value of maintaining relationships across factional lines. Her survival had depended not on the loyalty of any single group, but on having allies in multiple camps who could vouch for her character and usefulness. Most importantly, Wujia realized that her ultimate security lay not in attaching herself to any individual, no matter how powerful, but in making herself independently valuable to the imperial system itself. She needed to become so useful, so knowledgeable, and so connected that removing her would be more costly than protecting her. With Prince Lai Chainan disgraced and eventually exiled, Emperor Tang designated his ninth son, Lai Ji, as the new crown prince. Lai Ji was everything his predecessor had not been. Studious, respectful of tradition, and genuinely committed to preparing himself for imperial responsibilities. But he was also young, inexperienced, and somewhat overwhelmed by the enormous expectations now placed upon him. Wujia recognized an opportunity in the new crown prince's situation. Unlike her relationship with Lai Chen, which had been based on personal charm and administrative assistance, her approach to Li would be more strategic and carefully planned. She would position herself not as a friend or companion, but as an essential resource for his future success as emperor. She began by studying Li's personality, interests, and weaknesses with the same methodical approach she had applied to understanding his father. The young prince was intelligent, but lacked confidence in his own judgment. He was well educated in classical texts, but had little practical experience with the complexities of governing a vast empire. Most critically, he was surrounded by advisors who were either too differential to offer honest counsel or too focused on their own agendas to prioritize his interests. Wu Jiao slowly inserted herself into this advisory ecosystem, not as a replacement for existing counselors, but as a unique resource who could provide perspectives unavailable elsewhere. She offered insights into court gossip and factional dynamics that the prince's official tutors, bound by protocol and propriety, could not discuss. She provided honest assessments of policy proposals that his sycophantic attendants would never dare to criticize. More subtly, she began to position herself as Lu's window into the real world beyond the artificial environment of the palace. As a former merchant's daughter who had experienced poverty and uncertainty, she could explain the practical implications of imperial policies in ways that aristocratic advisors, insulated by generations of wealth and privilege, simply could not. This strategy required Wu Jiao to walk an incredibly fine line. She needed to be useful enough to the crown prince to secure his protection and patronage, but not so involved in his affairs that she would be seen as manipulating him for her own benefit. She had to demonstrate loyalty and wisdom while maintaining the appearance of proper deference and humility. The balancing act became even more complex as Emperor Tang's health began to decline in the late 640s. The emperor, now in his 50s and exhausted by decades of military campaigns and administrative responsibilities, was showing signs of age and illness that made the question of imperial succession increasingly urgent. Court officials began positioning themselves for the transition to a new reign, and the competition for influence with the future emperor intensified dramatically. Wu found herself caught between two different power structures. The existing imperial court centered around Emperor Tang where she had spent years building her position and the emerging court of Crown Prince Li Ju where she was working to establish new relationships and influence. Managing both relationships simultaneously required extraordinary diplomatic skill and political intelligence. She had to maintain her usefulness to the current emperor while building credibility with his successor. All while avoiding the appearance of disloyalty or opportunism that could destroy her standing with either man. This challenge was complicated by the fact that father and son despite their mutual respect and affection had different personalities, priorities, and governing philosophies that sometimes put them at odds with each other. Emperor Tang was a warrior scholar who had personally led armies and conquered territories. He valued direct action, personal courage, and decisive leadership. His approach to governance was hands-on and pragmatic, shaped by his experience as a military commander who had learned to make quick decisions based on incomplete information. Crown Prince Li Ji by contrast was more contemplative and cautious. He preferred to study problems thoroughly before acting, to consult multiple advisors before making decisions, and to consider the long-term implications of policies rather than focusing on immediate results. His governing style was more collaborative and systematic than his father's, but also potentially slower and more indecisive. Wu Jiao adapted her approach to each man's personality and preferences. With Emperor Tang, she emphasized practical solutions and immediate benefits. She presented information concisely, offered clear recommendations, and demonstrated how her suggestions aligned with his existing priorities and policies. Her communications with him were direct, confident, and focused on results. With Crown Prince Li Ji, she took a more nuanced approach. She presented multiple perspectives on complex issues, acknowledged uncertainties and potential complications, and emphasized the importance of building consensus among different factions before implementing major changes. Her interactions with him were more differential and collaborative, positioning herself as a resource to support his decision-making process rather than as an advocate for specific outcomes. This dual strategy worked brilliantly for several years, allowing Wu Zhou to strengthen her position with both the current and future emperor while avoiding the factional conflicts that destroyed many other court figures during succession periods. But it also created new vulnerabilities that would soon test her political skills to their limits. As Emperor Tang's health continued to deteriorate, rumors began circulating about an improper relationship between Wu Jiao and Crown Prince Li Ju. These rumors were probably inevitable given the amount of time they spent together and the obvious intelligence and ambition that Wu Jiao displayed. In a court culture that viewed women primarily as sexual objects rather than political actors, any significant interaction between an attractive concubine and a young prince would be interpreted through a romantic lens. The rumors were particularly dangerous because they violated fundamental protocols governing imperial succession. Concubines belonged to the emperor and were expected to remain loyal to him alone. Any suggestion that a concubine was cultivating relationships with potential successors could be interpreted as treason, adultery, or both. Even if the relatio administrative, the appearance of impropriety could be enough to destroy everyone involved. Wu Zhou realized that her carefully constructed position was becoming untenable. She could not continue building influence with Li Jie without risking accusations that could lead to her execution. But she also could not abandon her investment in the future emperor without sacrificing the security and power she had worked so hard to achieve. The solution she devised was characteristically bold and risky. Rather than trying to hide or minimize her relationship with the crown prince, Wu Jie decided to reframe it entirely. She would transform what appeared to be a liability into a strategic advantage by changing the fundamental terms of the discussion. In early 649, as Emperor Tang lay dying, Wu Jiao made a decision that would alter the course of Chinese history. Instead of waiting passively for events to unfold around her, she chose to take control of her own destiny in a way that no woman in Chinese history had ever attempted. But that remarkable gamble and its even more extraordinary consequences would have to wait for the emperor's death and the beginning of an entirely new phase in Wu Zhou's relentless pursuit of ultimate power. The death of Emperor Tang in 649 CE marked the end of an era and the beginning of Wu Jie's most dangerous gamble yet. According to ancient Chinese tradition, when an emperor died, his concubines faced one of two fates. They could be buried alive with their master to serve him in the afterlife, or they could have their heads shaved and spend the remainder of their lives as Buddhist nuns in remote monasteries. Neither option offered any possibility of maintaining political influence or personal freedom. For most concubines, this transition represented the inevitable end of whatever brief moment of luxury and relevance they had experienced. They would disappear into obscurity, forgotten by history and irrelevant to the future of the empire. But Wu Jiao had spent over a decade preparing for exactly this moment, and she had no intention of accepting either traditional fate. The funeral of Emperor Tang was a spectacular display of imperial grandeur that lasted for months. His body lay in state in the magnificent Daming Palace while officials from across the empire traveled to Chang'an to pay their respects. Buddhist monks chanted prayers for his soul. Confucian scholars composed elaborate eulogies celebrating his achievements and Taoist priests performed rituals to ensure his peaceful transition to the afterlife. Wu Jiao participated in these ceremonies with perfect propriety, displaying the grief and devotion expected from an imperial concubine. She wore the white robes of mourning, wept at the appropriate moments, and followed all the complex protocols that govern behavior during the extended funeral period. To outside observers, she appeared to be just another grieving woman preparing to accept her fate as a discarded relic of the previous reign. But beneath this facade of traditional feminine submission, Wu Jiao was executing the most audacious political maneuver in Chinese history. During the chaotic weeks between the emperor's death and his successor's formal coronation, she was secretly communicating with Crown Prince Li, now preparing to become Emperor Gaozong. These communications were extraordinarily dangerous, as any contact between a dead emperor's concubine and his successor could be interpreted as evidence of an adulterous relationship that had begun while Tang was still alive. The content of these messages has been lost to history, but their effect was unmistakable. Instead of allowing Wu Jiao to disappear into a monastery as tradition demanded, the new Emperor Gaozong intervened to change her fate. Using his authority as the new ruler, he declared that Wu Jiao's administrative skills and intellectual abilities were too valuable to waste on religious contemplation. He announced that she would be recalled to the imperial court to serve in his government. This decision shocked the entire imperial establishment. Never before had a Chinese emperor recalled his father's concubine to active service. The precedent was not just unusual, it was unthinkable. Court officials were horrified by what they saw as a violation of fundamental moral principles that governed imperial behavior. Buddhist monks were scandalized by the emperor's apparent disregard for proper religious observances. Even common people throughout the empire gossiped about the young emperor's strange decision to surround himself with his father's former women. But Emperor Gaozong was not acting impulsively or irrationally. He was a thoughtful, methodical ruler who had spent years observing Wu Jiao's capabilities and understanding her potential value to his administration. Unlike his father, who had been an experienced military commander and seasoned politician when he took power, Gaozong was ascending to the throne as a young man with limited practical experience in governance. The Tang Empire in 649 was facing numerous challenges that required immediate attention. Turkish tribes were launching raids along the northern frontier. Korean kingdoms were resisting Chinese influence on the peninsula and internal rebellions were flaring up in several provinces. The imperial bureaucracy was dominated by powerful aristocratic families who had their own agendas and were not necessarily loyal to the new emperor. Managing these complex problems required advisors who were both competent and completely dependent on imperial favor for their position and security. Wu Jia fit this description perfectly. Her intelligence and administrative skills had been proven over years of service to Emperor Tang. Her merchant family background meant she had no independent power base that might compete with imperial authority. Most importantly, her controversial return to court made her completely dependent on Emperor Gaozong's protection. She could not survive politically without his support, which meant her loyalty was guaranteed in ways that traditional aristocratic advisors could never match. The emperor's decision to recall Wu Jiao was therefore both personally motivated and politically shrewd. He was bringing back a woman he trusted and found intellectually stimulating. But he was also acquiring a uniquely valuable political asset who could help him navigate the treacherous early years of his reign. Wu Jia returned to the imperial court in 650, not as a concubine, but as something entirely new in Chinese history. A female government official with real administrative responsibilities and political influence. Her formal title was modest, but her actual role was far more significant. She had direct access to the emperor, participated in policy discussions, and gradually began to influence major decisions about both domestic governance and foreign policy. Her first major challenge was establishing credibility with the existing court bureaucracy, most of whom viewed her appointment as a dangerous precedent that violated traditional gender roles and governmental procedures. These officials had spent their entire careers climbing through established hierarchies based on literary examinations, family connections, and factional loyalties. The sudden appearance of a woman with direct imperial access and apparent policy influence threatened their understanding of how government was supposed to work. Wu Jiao addressed this resistance with characteristic intelligence and patience. Rather than trying to directly confront or override the existing bureaucratic establishment, she found ways to work within and around existing systems. She focused initially on areas where her unique background and skills provided clear advantages that even skeptical officials had to acknowledge. Her experience as a merchant's daughter, for example, gave her insights into trade and economic policy that aristocratic officials lacked. When debates arose about tax collection, commercial regulations, or infrastructure projects, Wu Jiao could provide practical perspectives based on real-world experience rather than theoretical knowledge. Her recommendations were often more effective than those offered by officials whose understanding of economics came entirely from classical texts. She also leveraged her years of observation and relationship building within the imperial court to become an invaluable source of information about factional dynamics and personal rivalries among government officials. Emperor Gaozong, like any ruler, needed to understand the complex web of alliances and conflicts within his administration in order to make effective personnel decisions and prevent conspiracies. Wu Jiao's comprehensive knowledge of court politics made her an essential intelligence resource. More subtly, she began to position herself as a bridge between the emperor and various constituencies that traditional advisors found difficult to understand or communicate with effectively. Her humble origins allowed her to speak credibly about the concerns of merchants, farmers, and artisans in ways that aristocratic officials could not. Her gender gave her access to information about the imperial harem and the concerns of court women that male advisors never heard. This multifaceted approach gradually established Wu Jiao as an indispensable member of Emperor Gaozong's inner circle. Officials who had initially opposed her appointment began to recognize her value and seek her support for their own initiatives. Factional leaders who had viewed her as an outsider started treating her as a potential ally whose influence with the emperor could advance their interests. But Wu Jiao's growing political influence created new dangers that she had to navigate carefully. The more important she became to the emperor's government, the more threatening she appeared to established power centers that had reasons to limit her authority. The most dangerous opposition came from the empress and the imperial in-laws who had expected to dominate the new reign. Empress Wang had married Li Ju several years before his accession to the throne, and she had reasonable expectations that becoming emperor would elevate her to a position of significant influence within the court. As the official wife of the ruler, she should have been the most important woman in the empire with authority over the imperial household and informal influence over policy decisions affecting women and family matters. Instead, Empress Wang found herself increasingly marginalized by Wu Jiao's growing influence with her husband. The emperor spent more time consulting with Wu Jiao about government business than he did discussing personal matters with his official wife. Court observers began to notice that Wu Jiao's recommendations carried more weight in imperial decision-making than the empress's opinions. This situation was not just personally humiliating for Empress Wang, it was politically dangerous for her entire extended family. The Wang clan had invested heavily in her marriage to the future emperor, expecting that her position as empress would provide them with preferential access to government positions, lucrative contracts, and policy influence. If Wu Jiao continued to gain power at the empress's expense, the Wang family's political investments would lose value and their rivals would gain advantages. Empress Wang's response to this challenge revealed both her limitations as a political strategist and the fundamental differences between her approach to power and Wu Jiao's methods. Rather than trying to compete with Wu Jiao on intellectual or administrative grounds, the empress focused on emphasizing traditional gender roles and moral propriety. She positioned herself as the defender of conventional values against Wu Jiao's dangerous innovations. This strategy had some initial success among conservative court officials who were already uncomfortable with Wu Jiao's unprecedented role in government. Empress Wang argued that allowing a former concubine to participate in policy discussions violated fundamental principles of imperial dignity and Confucian morality. She suggested that the emperor's reliance on Wu Jiao's advice was inappropriate and potentially corrupting to the moral foundation of imperial rule. But Empress Wang's approach suffered from a critical weakness. It offered no practical alternative to Wu Jiao's contributions. The empress could criticize Wu Jiao's influence, but she could not replace Wu Jiao's administrative skills, political intelligence, or economic insights. Her arguments were based on abstract principles rather than concrete benefits, which made them less compelling to an emperor who was struggling with real governmental challenges. Wu Jiao recognized the threat that Empress Wang represented, but she also understood that direct confrontation would be counterproductive. Any open conflict between the emperor's wife and his advisor would force Emperor Gaozong to choose sides, and traditional protocol strongly favored the empress in such disputes. Wu Jiao needed a more subtle approach that would undermine her rival without creating an obvious crisis. Her solution was to make herself even more indispensable while simultaneously demonstrating the limitations of traditional approaches to imperial administration. When policy debates arose, Wu Jiao consistently offered more practical and effective solutions than other advisors, including implicit alternatives to suggestions from the empress's faction. When administrative problems emerged, she provided faster and more comprehensive responses than established bureaucratic channels. More importantly, Wu Jia began to document and publicize her contributions to successful. When her recommendations led to increased tax revenues, she made sure the emperor understood her role in achieving those results. When her insights helped resolve diplomatic conflicts or prevent internal rebellions, she ensured that her contributions were recorded in official documents and remembered by key officials. This systematic approach to building and demonstrating her value created a powerful argument for maintaining and expanding her influence that was based on measurable results rather than theoretical principles. Even officials who were philosophically opposed to female participation in government found it difficult to argue against Wu Jia's track record of successful policy contributions. The competition between Wu Jiao and Empress Wang intensified throughout the early 650s as both women worked to consolidate their influence with the emperor and build supporting coalitions among court officials. This rivalry was complicated by the birth of children to both women, which added succession politics to the already complex dynamics of imperial court competition. Empress Wang gave birth to a daughter in 651, which was disappointing since male heirs were essential for securing dynastic succession. Wu Jiao, meanwhile, had given birth to a son in 652, followed by another son in 653. These births dramatically altered the balance of power between the two women. As Wu Jiao's sons represented potential heirs to the imperial throne, while the empress's daughter did not. The existence of male heirs born to Wu Jiao created new political possibilities that neither woman had previously considered. If something happened to Emperor Gaozong, or if he chose to designate one of Wu Jiao's sons as his successor, she could potentially become the mother of a future emperor. This prospect offered a path to long-term political security and influence that went far beyond her current role as an imperial advisor. But the birth of these children also created new vulnerabilities and dangers. Court protocol regarding imperial succession was complex and politically sensitive, with established procedures for determining which sons should be considered legitimate heirs and which women should be recognized as imperial mothers. Wu Jiao's irregular status as a recalled concubine rather than an official wife complicated these calculations and provided her enemies with new arguments against her growing influence. The situation became even more complex in 654 when tragedy struck the imperial family in a way that would forever change the trajectory of Wu Jia's career and Chinese history itself. The specific details of what happened remain controversial among historians, but the consequences were undeniable. Empress Wang's infant daughter died under mysterious circumstances, and Wu Jiao was accused of murdering the child to eliminate a potential rival. The accusation was devastating and potentially fatal. If Wu Jiao was found guilty of murdering an imperial child, she would face immediate execution along with all her relatives and associates. The charge was particularly dangerous because it combined several of the most serious crimes possible in imperial China. Treason against the royal family, violation of fundamental moral principles governing the protection of children, and abuse of trusted access to the imperial household. But the accusation also revealed the desperation of Wu Jia's enemies and their inability to challenge her influence through conventional political means. The timing and circumstances of the charges suggested that they were motivated more by factional rivalry than by genuine. Her response to the murder accusation would demonstrate both her political genius and her willingness to use the most ruthless methods necessary to protect and advance her position. The strategies she employed during this crisis would establish patterns of behavior that would characterize her entire subsequent career as she climbed toward ultimate power in the Chinese Empire. But the specific tactics Wu Jiao used to survive and triumph over this potentially deadly challenge and the long-term consequences of her choices for both her own future and the stability of the Tang Dynasty would prove to be even more extraordinary than anything she had accomplished so far. The murder accusation against Wu Jiao represented the most dangerous moment of her political career, but it also revealed the fundamental weakness of her enemy's position. The charges were based more on court gossip and factional animosity than on actual evidence, which gave Wu Jia room to maneuver if she could control the narrative and turn public opinion in her favor. Her first move was characteristically bold and unexpected. Instead of retreating into defensive denials or seeking protection through traditional channels, Wu Jiao chose to go on the offensive against her accusers. She began by systematically documenting the timeline of events surrounding the infant's death, gathering testimony from servants, physicians, and other witnesses who had been present in the imperial household during the relevant period. This investigation revealed several inconvenient facts that undermined the murder theory. The child had been ill for several days before dying, showing symptoms consistent with common childhood diseases that claimed many imperial infants despite the best medical care available. Multiple physicians had examined the baby and prescribed treatments that proved ineffective. Most importantly, Wu Jiao had been in the company of other court officials during most of the period when the alleged crime supposedly occurred, making it practically impossible for her to have administered poison or committed other acts of violence. But Wu Jiao understood that facts alone would not be sufficient to protect her from politically motivated accusations. She needed to shift the entire framework of the debate from questions about her guilt or innocence to larger issues about the stability and effectiveness of imperial government. Her survival depended on making herself appear more valuable to the emperor and the empire than her enemies. She accomplished this transformation by positioning the accusations against her as part of a broader conspiracy by conservative factions to undermine Emperor Gaozong's authority and reverse the administrative reforms that had made his government more effective than his predecessors. Wu Jiao argued that her enemies were using the tragedy of an infant's death as a pretext to attack innovative approaches to governance that threatened their traditional privileges and power. This reframing was politically brilliant because it transformed Wu Jiao from a defendant in a criminal case into a symbol of progressive government reform. Officials who supported modernizing the imperial bureaucracy found themselves defending Wu Jiao not because they necessarily liked her personally, but because attacking her meant attacking the broader reform agenda they favored. Conversely, officials who opposed her found themselves associated with reactionary resistance to beneficial changes in government operations. Emperor Gaozong, who had invested significant political capital in Wu Jia's appointment and had personally benefited from her administrative contributions, recognized the implications of the accusations immediately. If Wu Jiao was removed from government under these circumstances, it would signal that traditional factions could veto his personnel decisions and policy initiatives by manufacturing scandals and moral controversies. His authority as emperor would be permanently undermined if he allowed politically motivated accusations to determine who could serve in his administration. The emperor's response demonstrated both his political sophistication and his genuine commitment to protecting Wu Jiao from her enemies. Rather than conducting a private investigation that might be influenced by factional pressures, he announced that the accusations would be examined through formal legal procedures that would be open to observation by court officials and foreign diplomats. This transparency made it much more difficult for Wu Jiao's enemies to manipulate evidence or testimony. More importantly, Emperor Gaozong used the investigation as an opportunity to review and strengthen Wu Jiao's official position within the government hierarchy. He announced that regardless of the outcome of the criminal charges, Wu Jiao's administrative contributions had been so valuable that her role would be expanded and formalized through new titles and responsibilities that would make her status less vulnerable to future political attacks. This announcement sent a clear message to court factions about the emperor's priorities and expectations. Officials who wanted to maintain imperial favor would need to work with Wu Jiao rather than against her. Those who continue to oppose her would find themselves increasingly isolated from the centers of power and decision-making. The formal investigation into the murder accusations proceeded slowly and carefully over several months with testimony from dozens of witnesses and examination of physical evidence by multiple experts. The process was designed to be thorough enough to satisfy skeptics while also demonstrating the weakness of the case against Wu Jiao. During this period, Wu Jiao continued to perform her administrative duties with characteristic competence and efficiency. She participated in policy meetings, drafted government documents, and provided advice on diplomatic and military matters, as if the accusations against her were merely a temporary distraction. This behavior reinforced her image as a dedicated public servant whose primary concern was effective governance rather than personal survival. The investigation's final report issued in early 655 officially exonerated Wu Jiao of any criminal wrongdoing in the infant's death. The report concluded that the child had died of natural causes, possibly complicated by inadequate medical knowledge about treating childhood illnesses. More significantly, the report criticized officials who had promoted the murder accusations as having acted irresponsibly and potentially harmfully to imperial interests. But Wu Jiao's vindication came with costs that would shape her future political strategies. The months of controversy had revealed the depth of opposition to her influence among traditional court factions and the lengths to which her enemies would go to remove her from power. She understood that surviving this particular attack did not guarantee protection from future conspiracies and that her position remained fundamentally vulnerable as long as she lacked formal authority that could not be easily challenged. Her solution to this problem would prove to be even more audacious than her previous political maneuvers. Instead of simply trying to strengthen her existing position as an imperial advisor, Wu Jiao began planning to fundamentally transform her status within the imperial hierarchy in ways that would make future attacks against her much more difficult and dangerous for her enemies. The key to this transformation lay in her relationship with Emperor Gaozong and her growing influence over imperial succession politics. Wu Jiao had already demonstrated her value as an administrator and policy advisor. But these roles, however important, were still technically subordinate positions that could be eliminated if political circumstances changed. She needed to acquire a form of power that was more permanent and legally protected. The solution she devised involved leveraging her position as the mother of potential imperial heirs to claim formal recognition as an imperial wife rather than merely a recalled concubine. This change in status would not only provide her with greater legal protections and ceremonial authority, but would also position her sons as legitimate candidates for imperial succession, giving her a long-term stake in the dynasty's future. But achieving this transformation required Wu Jiao to overcome centuries of precedent and protocol that governed imperial marriages and succession procedures. No emperor in Chinese history had ever elevated a former concubine of his father to the status of empress, and the practical and symbolic implications of such an unprecedented action would create enormous resistance among traditional court factions. Wu Jiao began preparing for this campaign by systematically building support among key constituencies whose backing would be essential for success. She cultivated relationships with military commanders who valued her insights into strategic planning and resource allocation. She developed alliances with provincial governors who appreciated her understanding of local economic conditions and administrative challenges. Most importantly, she strengthened her connections with younger court officials who were more open to innovative approaches to governance and less committed to traditional restrictions on female participation in politics. This coalition-building effort required Wu Jiao to demonstrate her value to each group in terms they found compelling and relevant to their specific interests and concerns. Military officers needed to see evidence that her influence led to better funding and strategic planning for their campaigns. Provincial administrators